The morning Delia Marsh walked into Callaway's Pawn and Trade, she told herself it would only take 10 minutes. She had rehearsed it the whole drive over, the 11 miles from her studio apartment in Clarksburg to the strip mall off Route 9, where Callaway's sat between a nail salon and a check-cashing place. She would walk in, lay the box on the counter, take whatever they offered, and walk out. 10 minutes. Maybe less if the man behind the counter didn't ask questions. She hadn't counted on the dog, but that part comes later. What matters first is understanding how a 31-year-old Army trauma nurse, a woman who had worked 36-hour shifts in a forward operating base outside Kandahar, who had held pressure on wounds that would have made most people faint, who had been awarded the Army Commendation Medal with Valor device and a combat medical badge she'd earned the hardest possible way, ended up in a strip mall pawn shop on a Tuesday morning in November, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the steering wheel. Delia had been a nurse for 6 years. 4 of those years she spent deployed. She came back from her second tour in 2022 with a body that worked fine and a mind that needed some convincing. She'd done the counseling. She'd done the paperwork. She'd transitioned out of the Army on an honorable discharge with a folder full of commendations and letters of recommendation from 2 commanding officers and a surgeon named Dr. Pembroke, who told her she had the steadiest hands under pressure he'd ever seen in a non-physician. She'd gotten hired at Millhaven Regional Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia, 8 months after she got home. ICU, night shift. She was good at the work in the way that people are good at things they have paid serious prices for, not with ease, but with a kind of grim competence that the other nurses noticed and that the attending physicians appreciated without always saying so. For a while, things were fine. Not wonderful, but fine. She paid rent. She kept her car running. She called her mother in Wheeling on Sunday evenings. She existed in the narrow, functional way that people who have survived hard things sometimes do when they're trying to figure out who they are now that the hard thing is over. The trouble started in March. A patient, a 63-year-old man named Theodore Plunkett, admitted for post-surgical complications following a knee replacement, coded on her shift. Delia ran the response. She did everything correctly. The attending on call, a hospitalist named Dr. DeGraves, arrived 4 minutes after the code was called and took over. Theodore Plunkett died at 2:47 a.m. His family was devastated. His daughter filed a complaint with the hospital's patient advocacy office, claiming that nursing response had been delayed. It hadn't been. Delia had the timestamps. She had documented everything in the chart within seconds of each intervention, the way she'd been trained. The response time was 2 minutes and 14 seconds from code call to first intervention, well within protocol. But Millhaven Regional had been going through a difficult quarter. There had been 2 other adverse outcomes that season, both generating noise, and the administration was under pressure. Gerald Linwood, the director of nursing operations, a man who had never worked a floor shift in his career and who wore shirts with his initials on the cuffs, quietly recommended that the complaint be taken seriously. An internal review was opened. Delia was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. She was told it would take 4 to 6 weeks. It took 4 months. The first month, she was okay. She had savings, not a lot, but enough to cover rent and groceries and the minimum payment on her student loans. She spent her days running, cleaning her apartment, reading. She went to her VA therapist twice a week. She tried not to think about the chart she'd already submitted, the documentation that was so clear a nursing student could have read it and understood that she had done nothing wrong. The second month, she called the union rep, a tired man named Henderson who told her these things take time and that the hospital was following procedure. She called him again 3 weeks later. He said the same thing in different words. The third month, she burned through the last of her savings. She applied for jobs at 2 other hospitals in the region. Millhaven's HR department, when contacted for employment verification, flagged her record as pending review. One hospital never called back. The other rescinded their offer the day before orientation was scheduled to begin. She didn't have to ask why. She sold her television. She sold her grandmother's china, piece by piece, to a woman she found on Facebook Marketplace who collected Depression-era glassware and paid $40 for things worth 3 times that. She sold her road bike, the one she'd bought with her re-enlistment bonus in 2019. She ate rice and eggs and whatever was marked down at the Save-A-Lot on Fairview Avenue. She did not tell her mother. The 4th month, she opened the cedar box she kept on the top shelf of her closet and looked at what was inside for the first time in a year and a half. The medals were in their original cases, the Army Commendation Medal in its maroon box, the combat medical badge mounted on a shadow frame her unit had given her when she rotated out, and a coin, a challenge coin from Major Tennyson, her commanding officer, given at a ceremony outside Fob Shindand in the rain with the words "When it mattered most" engraved on the back. She closed the box. She put it back on the shelf. She lasted another 3 weeks before she took it down again. Callaway's Pawn and Trade opened at 9. Delia got there at 9:15. After sitting in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes listening to the radio and then not listening to the radio and then turning it off and sitting in the silence until the silence felt worse than going inside. The shop smelled like old electronics and machine oil. There was a glass case running the length of the counter filled with watches, rings, hunting knives, 2 handguns secured with trigger locks. Behind the counter, an older man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead was sorting through a box of cables. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Morning." Delia set the cedar box on the counter. The man, his name was Frank Callaway. She'd find out later. Frank, who had run this shop for 22 years and who had a son in the Marines, looked at the box, then at her, then back at the box. "What've you got?" "Military decorations." She opened the box. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Army Commendation Medal with Valor, combat medical badge, and a challenge coin. Frank Callaway set down the cables. He picked up the reading glasses from his forehead and put them on. He looked at the medals for a long moment without touching them. "These yours?" "Yes." He looked at her then, really looked, the kind of look that took in the way she was standing, the dark circles she'd stopped trying to cover with concealer 2 weeks ago, the way her hands were clasped in front of her on the counter like she was trying to keep them from doing something else. "Valor device on that ARCOM," he said. "Yes, that's not easy to earn." She didn't say anything. He was quiet for a moment. Then, from somewhere behind her to the left, she heard the sound. Not a bark, not a whine, but a low, deliberate exhale, the kind of sound a large animal makes when it has decided something. She turned around. The dog was enormous. A Belgian Malinois, tawny and black, wearing a tactical vest the color of coyote fur. It was sitting in the middle of the shop floor, very still, looking at her. Not at the medals, at her. She hadn't heard it come in. She hadn't heard the door. She hadn't heard anything. "That's not mine," Frank Callaway said, with the tone of a man clarifying something that needed clarifying. His name was Sergeant First Class Daniel Wick. He was 38 years old, and he had been a Special Forces medic before a roadside IED in Helmand Province took most of his left knee and ended his operational career. He now worked as a civilian contractor doing security consulting, and the dog, a 7-year-old Malinois named Colt, had been his partner for 4 years before Wick's injury ended their deployment together. He'd adopted Colt through the MWD adoption program after the dog was retired, which anyone who knew anything about military working dogs would tell you was not a simple process. Wick had been in Callaway's that morning to pick up a rifle scope he'd repaired. He'd come in through the side entrance, which Frank kept unlocked for regulars, and he'd been in the back room when Delia walked in. He'd heard the exchange. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop. But when Colt pulled toward the front of the shop with the particular urgency that Wick had learned, over 4 years of working together, meant something more than idle curiosity, he followed. Colt walked directly to Delia. He didn't rush. He moved the way military dogs move when they're working, deliberate, unhurried, certain. He stopped 2 feet in front of her and sat. Then he pressed his nose gently against her right hand, the one still clasped over the left, and he held it there. Delia looked down at him. She didn't move. Later, she would say that what she felt in that moment was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't been overseas, hadn't worked alongside dogs like this one, hadn't understood what it meant when an animal with that level of training and that much combat experience chose to make itself present for you. She said it felt like being recognized, not pitied, not helped. Recognized. She didn't cry, but it was close. Wick stepped out from behind the display rack where he'd stopped, and he said simply, "I'm sorry to interrupt. My name is Wick. That's Colt. He doesn't usually do that." Delia looked up. "Do what?" "Choose someone." She didn't tell him everything that day. She wasn't that kind of person. She didn't spill things to strangers, didn't make herself available for other people's concern. But Wick didn't ask for everything. He asked one question, and he asked it quietly, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed and his weight on his right leg. The way people learn to stand when one knee doesn't fully cooperate, he said, "What happened?" And something about the way he asked, without the head tilt that people use when they want credit for caring, without the follow-up already loaded and waiting, made her answer him honestly. She told him about Theodore Plunkett, about the complaint, about the 4 months, about the 2 hospitals that wouldn't hire her, about the cedar box. When she finished, Wick was quiet for a moment. Colt had moved during the telling. He'd positioned himself beside her, his shoulder against her left calf, and he hadn't moved since. A dog doing what he'd been built to do, which was pay attention to what a person needed without being asked. "You have the documentation," Wick said. "Your chart entries, timestamps, all of it." "Yes." "Have you talked to an attorney?" "I can't afford. There are people who take cases like this on contingency." He paused. "Military-connected people. I can make a call." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why would you do that?" He glanced at the cedar box, still open on the counter. Then he looked back at her. "Because I've seen what it takes to earn those," he said. "And I know what it costs to think about selling them." The attorney's name was Susan Farley. She was 44 years old, a former JAG officer who had spent 8 years in military law before transitioning to private practice in Morgantown, 40 miles east. Wick had her number in his phone, had used her twice before for other veterans in other messes. He texted her from the parking lot of Callaway's while Delia sat in her car with Colt's head in her lap through the open passenger window, a thing the dog had decided to do without anyone asking him to. Farley called back in 11 minutes. She reviewed Delia's documentation by phone that afternoon and in person 3 days later. What she found, once she began pulling records through formal channels, was worse than what Delia had known. The internal review had not been completed in 60 days, as required by the hospital's own policy and by West Virginia Nursing Board regulations. It had been extended twice, both times without formal written notification to Delia. A procedural violation. More importantly, when Farley subpoenaed the complete review file, she found that the patient timeline submitted to the review board by Dr. Graves had a discrepancy of 6 minutes from the actual chart entries, a discrepancy that consistently made Delia's response look slower than it had been. It wasn't conclusive proof of deliberate falsification, but it was enough. Farley filed a formal complaint with the West Virginia Board of Examiners for registered professional nurses on Delia's behalf, along with a civil claim against Millhaven Regional for wrongful suspension and defamation through the employment verification flag. She also sent a letter, through certified mail, to Gerald Linwood, copied to the hospital's legal department, outlining the procedural violations and the documentation discrepancy. The hospital's legal department responded within a week. What happened next wasn't fast. Things like this are never fast. There were depositions and counterfilings, and a period of 3 weeks in December when Farley warned her that Millhaven's attorneys might try to settle quietly and seal the records, which would mean money but no acknowledgement of what had actually happened. Delia thought about it for 2 days. She called her mother, finally, after months, and told her everything. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was unusual. When Delia was done, her mother said, "What do you want?" Delia said she wanted them to say they were wrong. "Then don't take the quiet money," her mother said. She didn't take the quiet money. In February, the West Virginia Board of Examiners found no grounds for any disciplinary action against Delia's nursing license. Their written findings specifically noted that her documentation met and exceeded standard of care requirements, and that the response time in question was within acceptable protocol parameters. It was 4 paragraphs long and written in the dry, formal language of regulatory bodies, and Delia read it 6 times sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold. In March, Millhaven Regional settled the civil claim. The terms included a formal written apology from the hospital's chief medical officer, not Linwood, who had resigned in January citing personal reasons, but a woman named Dr. Patricia Holst, who had been brought in as interim and who, to her credit, didn't flinch from what the letter needed to say. It included the removal of the employment verification flag. It included back pay for the 4 months of administrative leave. The settlement amount beyond that was confidential, but it was enough that Delia could pay off her student loans and put a deposit on a better apartment and take her mother to dinner somewhere that had cloth napkins. The hospitals also, at Farley's insistence, revised its internal review procedures to require mandatory written notification to any nurse on administrative leave if a review exceeded 45 days. It was a small change in a large institution. It would help someone else someday. That mattered to Delia more than she could easily explain. She went back to nursing. Not at Millhaven. She had no interest in going back to Millhaven. She took a position at Morgantown General's ICU day's shift through a recruiter who had seen Susan Farley's name in a trade newsletter and called Delia directly. The charge nurse on her unit was a woman named Beverly, who had worked trauma for 20 years and who shook Delia's hand on her first day and said, "I know what you went through. I read about it. You don't have to talk about it, and you don't have to prove anything here." Delia thanked her and went to work. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The steadiness that Dr. Pembroke had noticed in Kandahar was still there, still the same. Hard things had not taken it. They had, if anything, made it more certain, the way some metals become stronger under the right kind of heat, not weaker. The cedar box stayed on the shelf. She didn't take it down again, not to look at it, not to consider it, not for any of the reasons she had taken it down that November. But she did take out the challenge coin once, about a month after she started at Morgantown General. She sat with it at her kitchen table in the morning, in the early light before her shift, and she turned it over in her hands and read the engraving on the back. When it mattered most, she thought about the things that phrase had meant to her in different moments. What it had meant in Kandahar, in the rain, with her unit standing around her and Major Tennyson's voice carrying over the wind. What it had meant in the pawn shop, when she'd set the box on a glass counter and tried to make herself believe she was done with the version of herself who had earned it. What it meant now on an ordinary morning in an ordinary kitchen, heading to a job where people needed her and where she was, without qualification, without asterisk, exactly the right person to be there. She put the coin back in the box. She got up. She put on her scrubs. She drove to work. Wick still lived in Clarksburg. She ran into him sometimes, at the commissary, once at the VA clinic, once at a diner on Marshall Street where he was having breakfast alone with Colt lying under the table like a piece of furniture that had always been there. They talk the way people talk when they've shared something real and don't need to narrate it every time they see each other. A few minutes, a cup of coffee, catching up on the practical things. How's the new job? How's the knee? How's your mother? Colt always found her in the room. She didn't know if that was training or something else, and she'd stopped trying to decide. He would cross whatever distance was between them and press his shoulder against her leg and stay there until she left. Every time. She'd asked Wick once, in the parking lot of the VA clinic, what he thought it meant when a dog did that, singled someone out that way. Wick had thought about it for a moment. He was not a person who answered quickly when the question deserved a real answer. "I think," he said finally, "that dogs trained the way Colt was trained spend years learning to find the thing in a situation that matters most, the thing underneath everything else, the real thing." He paused. "I think sometimes they bring that skill home with them." Delia looked at Colt, who was sitting between them in the parking lot, watching the middle distance with the calm, unhurried attention of an animal that has been to difficult places and come back from them and made a kind of peace. She understood that. She understood it the way you understand things that cost you something to learn. She reached down and put her hand on the dog's head. He leaned into it slightly, just enough to let her know he felt it, and then he went back to watching the middle distance. The way soldiers do, the way nurses do, the way people do, when they've learned the difference between the things that can break you and the things that, in the end, simply become part of what you're made of.